All right.
Hang on.
Are we live?
Vad sägs det? Yes! Yes! And it's working.
Perfect. So welcome everyone to this very much delayed tech session on Twitch. Today we're going to talk a lot about the technology and go pretty deep into visualizing a little bit the different debug modes we have to get a better understanding on the rendering. I'm going to talk a little bit about the physics, and then maybe if we have time we can do a little on the audio as well, depending on what you want to see. So if you just if you have comments, Emil is in the chat to we'll keep an eye on the chat, and I'll show a little bit from the game at the same time. All right, so let's start off with the rendering. I'm gonna fire up. Let's do this one. I think is good. So as you know, Teardown uses ray tracing for rendering. That is, it's a lot of games doing that nowadays, but Teardown does not rely on RTX for that. I have my own software implementation, or software. It does run on the GPUs. I guess it's a hardware implementation, but it's implemented entirely in a regular GLSL shader. And let's talk first a little bit about the scene and how it works, and we can get more into details later. So I'm going to show you the different render passes that's done, and we'll start with the depth pass. A lot of games do a depth pass before rendering anything else because it's has a lot of advantages because you can use that to cull stuff later. Teardown uses a G buffer approach, so I actually render depth and other things such as albedo and normal at the same time. All objects are only drawn once in Teardown, so I just draw all the objects once to a G buffer. Because drawing the scene is actually very, very time consuming. If we bring up the profiler here and look at this view, I'm gonna make it the actual rendering. We can see my timers here that the total drawing time for this particular frame is 14 milliseconds, and of which the G buffer is 5.23 something. So it's more than a third of the frame is just spent putting all the objects in the G buffer with absolutely no lighting, no post-processing, no nothing else. So the output from that G buffer pass is the depth, color, and normal, and we really just want to withdraw that once, because if we had to do it all one more time, that would be another 5 milliseconds. So there was a depth, and then another component of the G buffer which is drawn at the same time, but the result goes into a separate buffer, is the color buffer or the albedo buffer. So this is what the pure colors of the scene look like with no lighting. It's just and as you can see, it's rendered with no textures or anything. The individual voxels in Teardown are always single colored. If you look at the ground here, you can see that it looks textured, especially from a distance, and it is actually a texture, but it maps one pixel in that texture, maps a 1-to-1 with the voxels. So a voxel always has just one color. but it could actually technically have slightly different colors on each side because of this projection of the texturing. So anyway, that was the color, and then we have the normal as the last component of the G buffer. There's actually one more component of the G buffer we can talk about later. Normals are drawn because they are needed for lighting, and it's also pretty standard. So everything in green here is pointing upwards, everything in blue is pointing that way, and red is pointing this way. And because objects can have different rotations, you can also see it's not, we still need full normals because these are in world space. So we need to have a full normal that can point in any direction, even though the voxels only have 6 directions. And then I do, when the G buffer is in place, actually let's talk about the last thing in the G buffer, which is a velocity buffer, which basically records the motion of each pixel on the screen. And that motion is very important, not just for motion blur, which is the maybe most obvious usage for that, but even more importantly, it's used for the temporal anti-aliasing, which someone wrote in the chat right now. That's nice. So yes, Teardown uses temporal anti-aliasing. As you can see, that's why the screen is flickering, because temporal anti-aliasing, if you don't know what it is a way to do anti-aliasing by accumulating frames over time. And it's pretty standard nowadays, I think, in most engines. It's way cheaper than the previous anti-aliasing techniques that were used. And in many cases, I would say the result is actually also better. But it can result in flickering in sometimes. And I'm doing a couple of things in the engine to avoid flickering, but I don't think we should go into those tiny details here. Maybe I'll write that on the blog later. So there's also a separate buffer. I do a pass on the normals before lighting, which is smoothing them out a little bit. It's probably hard to see in this view, but if we take a look in the actual rendering, let's see if we find an angle here. Maybe when you played the game, you also seen it. Here, I think we can see it. Since the normals in the game are very sharp edges, I do a pass, just a post-processing pass on the normal buffer where I smooth out the normals a little bit based on a heuristic to get this. You can see there is a brighter line here at the edge, which wouldn't be there otherwise. That's because I kind of take the sharpness off the edge a little bit and smooth out a couple of pixels. And that makes quite a big difference for how the voxels are perceived. Like here you can see very clearly that there is this very subtle brightness on the edges in some cases that makes them look a little rounder. And that's just this processing of the normal buffer that does that. So there's no geometry involved for that. And I think maybe before we move on to the lighting, or do we have something from the chat? Maybe we should stop here and take questions.
There's a million questions already. Let's see if I can find some that are related to the tech. Could we have weight-based objects? For example, stone is heavy, so higher impact damage on landing. Would this be possible?
Let's stick to questions about what I talked about.
Okay.
If there's any questions on...
Does it use sparse voxel octree ray tracing, or does it use plain BVH ray tracing?
It's not... It is an octree, so I guess yes, a little bit. But let's move on. I think that will be answered in what I was talking about next. So let's show some debug rendering here. So this is what the objects look like that are drawn to the screen. Each yellow box here is a voxel shape, and it's oriented exactly the way it appears on the screen here. So it's aligned with the voxels themselves. And as you can see, they are, when modeling something for this game, we try to make, maybe it's a little hard to see here with all the lines, but let's take this tree here, for instance. It has one object for the leaves up here, and there is one object for the trunk. And that is because we don't want more volume than what's absolutely necessary to enclose the object. It does have to be a box, just because I use 3D textures to store this. So in many cases we have to split up objects in multiple shapes to not waste too much memory. But it's not only memory, because I will show you soon how this is traced out during the gbuffer pass, how we get the pixels on the screen, because there are no triangles in this game. Everything is is rendered directly from volume data. So if we switch over to, let's see if I can do this. Here where I can sketch a little bit. So assume we have the eye here, and we have our scene with different shapes. I'm going to do this in 2D, but you can extrapolate that to 3D.
Oh, the disappointment.
Wait for next generation mobile devices here for the 3D version. So this is our frustum here. So obviously the first thing that happens if an object is totally outside the frustum, it gets discarded immediately and not drawn at all. And then for the rest of the objects, these are the yellow boxes I just showed you. They're all their own voxel volumes, consisting of from, I don't know, what would be a typical size, maybe 50 by 50 by 50 up to 100. It could be anything up to 1 million or 2-3 million voxels, maybe in the biggest ones. And the way they are rendered with the bounding box, these yellow boxes you saw, that's what actually get drawn or fed to the rasterizer during the gbuffer pass. So translating this to 2D, we would draw this box here. Let's make it another color so we can see it. So this is what gets drawn. I actually draw the back face of each box. So in this case, we would draw these two. And as that gets rasterized to the screen, when drawing, say, this line here, we can trace out, actually, let's follow this ray here. It's going out from the eye. If we're rasterizing the pixel that's ending up here on the near plane. And we have an object that looks maybe like this. Let's see, we have voxels here. Okay. And the first thing we find out is the intersection point of this ray and the bounding box itself. And that point we can just compute mathematically to be, say it's here. So that's where we start the trace or the ray marching through the voxel volume. So we start with this voxel here and see that it is empty. And that means we're going to have to keep going. And the way we keep going is we use a voxel marching algorithm called Amanatides and Wu. It's a paper by Amanatides and Wu. Maybe you recognize the names. And that works, so you follow the edges of the voxels. So in this case, if we zoom in a little bit more, this was the first one. And keep going in that direction is going to hit this edge over here. And after hitting that edge, we know that we also going to have to check the neighboring voxel on to the right here. And since that's also empty, we keep going, stepping through, and then we know the next intersection point is on this edge here, and then we keep going like this. You can't just step equally sized steps like this, because then you're gonna end up missing stuff. So you're actually gonna do this Amanatides and Wu. It's also called supercover algorithm for traversing voxels. And we keep doing that until we hit something. And in this case, that means we're gonna have to check this edge and look in this one. There wasn't anything there. Keep going until we cross this edge, and then we switch over to this voxel. And here we actually found something. And what we found, the first voxel we enter where there is data is gonna determine the pixel color for this thing here. So this is gonna be a green pixel in that case. And what's actually stored in each voxel cell is just 1 byte of data. So this might be an 8, this might be 110, and so on. So there are no RGB values, there are no like reflectivity and stuff like that. All these are just index lookups into a palette that stores up to 255 different materials. And since we have multiple of these volumes, each one of those can have their own palette. So that's why you see more than 255 colors in the game, because every object can have 255 unique colors and materials. So back to the question on the octree. This is a very simplified explanation on how it works. In reality, I also do this hierarchically. You can see this as a 3D texture, each of these boxes. And I'm just using the standard MIP mapping feature of texture mapping to walk up and down that. Like it's basically an octree, but I only use the 2 first MIP levels. So I start doing this traversal in the second MIP, and then if I find a hit, I switch over to the first one, and then if I find something there, I finally go to the base level and check there. And then there is a pretty complex algorithm for knowing when to switch to a particular MIP level, because it's not always the most obvious one. You have to profile which is the fastest, to avoid recomputing a lot of these traversal constants and keeping the memory small to fit the caches in the shader and all that stuff. Was that very clear?
Extremely.
Good. Are there any questions on this part? Or
actually, I asked no, not anything particular. I asked people to hold on to the question for like assigned question time, because it's just streaming by.
Right. So just to, if someone missed the context of this is just for getting the G buffer on the screen, the color of the objects, the normals, and the depth. So this is not exactly what's happening for lighting. That comes later. How do you transform the ray into the voxel space of an object? That's just a matrix multiplication. So it's, I mean, you know the transform of each of these, and you know the transform of the camera, so you just make that conversion. How do you handle intersecting objects and the resulting depth ordering problems? That's actually a really good question that I spent a lot of time on, because since, as I said before, I'm only rendering the back face here. Technically in the shader, I know that the depth is not going to be, it's going to be somewhere in this box, but there's no way to express in the shader two bounds in between a depth value can be, and that can confuse the hardware, the C buffering hardware a little bit. So I have to do certain very specific techniques to draw them in multiple passes and record like an offline depth buffer that I can compare against in multiple passes for all this to work. I don't know if that was the answer to the question, but it gets pretty complicated. I know the depth once I've done the trace. The problem is that I don't know, say I draw this object here first and another part of the GPU, because all of these are kind of drawn in parallel because the GPU it's just doing a lot of parallel stuff. So this object right here can actually be drawn simultaneously as this object. And we don't know if parts of this object is going to be visible until we've rasterized this one. Traditionally in C-buffer techniques, the rasterizer can figure that out because it knows what parts will be covered and not, unless you discard the pixels in the shader. But in this case, we don't know that, because not until we've traversed the whole voxel volume, we know if there's going to be a hole where you can see all the way through this object and actually see something that is behind here. So depth is tricky to get right, and that is from a performance perspective only. I think we should move on to lighting. Or did you see some other question, Emil, that we should answer right away?
I think you can continue.
Yeah. So we switch back to this one, and so now we have the
one question that pops up. Do you store each object in a separate 3D texture, or are they all packed in a single 3D atlas?
They're all in their own 3D texture. So there are, I don't know how many shapes are there in this level. It's 2091. So there are more than 2000 3D textures in this scene. But it works surprisingly well, I would say. I didn't expect that to work when we started, but there doesn't seem to be a problem with it. So now that we have the G buffer, we are going to work on the lighting. This is the raw output of the first, of the diffuse part of the lighting. And it includes both the lighting from the sky dome and the light sources. I wish I had a way to separate them here, but I don't actually have that in this debug view. But if we go over here where there aren't any light sources, so here you can see more just the sky dome lighting. And I think this is probably the key to why lighting looks pretty realistic in Teardown, because I use this skydome lighting for, it's also called it's like a mix between ambient occlusion and skydome lighting. What it does is to send out rays for every pixel. For this pixel right here, it's going to send a number of random rays out in different directions and see if they hit the sky, basically. So it is what we call real ambient occlusion and not the fake screen space ambient occlusion that you can see in a lot of games, which doesn't look very good. The rays I use for ambient occlusion and this lighting pass are, let's see if I remember, I think there's 32 meters, so they're actually pretty long. So that's also why you see it gets much darker under the trees here. And also indoors, that relies entirely, now we actually, let's fix the lights here. It actually gets pretty dark. Where is that light?
It's magic.
Yeah, I don't know. Even in pretty large rooms, it gets pretty dark when you get inside like this, which is a good sign, because if the if these ambient occlusion rays were only like a couple of meters, this would be full daylight in here. And you can see that in a couple of places in the game. If we go into this, that's a bit larger. Maybe we're gonna start seeing some effects of that. Hard to say, but I think the most noticeable place in the game is this very large excuse me, warehouse on the Hollow Rock Island map. There you can definitely see some that it's much brighter than it actually should be in there, because the room is just bigger than the maximum distance of these light rays that I use for checking.
One question: how many rays do you send out per pixel?
I think it's 2.
That's a lot.
I think, let's see, if I turn down, if I remember correctly, this might be wrong, but I think if I set the render scale, no, sorry, not the render scale, the render quality to low, I think I just do 1. And you would see that by looking for more noise. The more rays you do per pixel, the less noise. And I think it does look a little more noisy now, right? It's probably hard to see on the stream, but so the way we send out these rays, I mean, the technique is super simple. For getting lighting that looks like this, that is super smooth and generally looks pretty good, just sending out 2 rays in random directions and record, add some light if you hit the sky, is actually a really simple way of doing it. But it matters a lot how you send out those rays, especially if you only send out a very small number of rays. And the way I do that is using blue noise, which you may see if you look at the characteristics of the noise. I don't know if this comes through in the stream at all, but the noise has this very high frequent look. It doesn't really look like a typical random noise. It is random, but it's random in a very specific way where it's only the high frequencies that comes through. And that means it's going to be much easier for us to smear out this noisy image into something that blends better together. So that's a really, really important part of this, is to use the right kind of noise and use it in the right way, because not only these two rays we send out per pixel, we don't want to send one ray this way and have the other ray go like almost the same way, because that would be a huge waste. We want them to be very separate, but we don't want to sample the same direction every frame, because we want to cover the whole hemisphere for that pixel. So we have to make sure to cast them as far away from the previous rays as possible, and still cover the whole dome, which is super complicated if you do this in 3D and consider all 3 dimensions, and also time in that, because we don't want to be, for every frame they also have to be pretty different. So that's the most important light pass, and when that is done, and I'm gonna talk a little bit later on how that's done, more specifically how this ray tracing is done on the GPU. I do a little bit of denoising on that. It looks very flickery here, but that's actually not just the noise itself. It's also because of this temporal anti-aliasing. Since the geometry here is so detailed, it's also quite annoying that you get so much noise from just the temporal anti-aliasing jitter. But I have some techniques in to fix that up later in the pipeline. But since this is a raw image from the lighting itself, it comes through very visibly here. But if we look at the noise here, you can see it's still it's still very visibly noisy, even though it has been going through a pass of denoising. And the reason it looks better in the final game is because of the temporal anti-aliasing, which tends to eat up a lot of noise when you smooth this out over time. So when we have that, we add the colors back in that we have in the G buffer already. I don't know why why it's so dark. I must have there must be a problem with the scaling here, because it shouldn't be this dark. But that's pretty much it for the excuse me, for the diffuse lighting. All the magic happens in this pass, and then there is some denoising and just mixing it with the diffuse colors. And then the second part, important part of the lighting, is the reflections, which is done very much the same way, just casting rays.
Dennis, I'll sneak in a couple of questions.
Yes.
Which I think is relevant to the ray tracing. Did you consider updating the depth buffer from the shader to resolve occlusion using shader depth output? It does prevent early set culling, but would be very simple.
Say that one more time.
I'll send it to you in the Discord so you can read and consider it. I can manage. There you go.
Does sound interesting. Let's see. Did you consider updating the depth buffer from the shader to resolve occlusion shader depth output? That is not possible. That's what I want to do, but at least in OpenGL, I didn't find a way to do that. I think I actually had contact with someone at NVIDIA about this, and they suggested a method that I haven't tried yet. So there might be, it's technically a very good idea. I just didn't find a way to implement that yet. But Send me a message on Twitter if you know exactly how to do this, and I would be very interested.
And here's another one. I sent it to you in text.
All right. And just as a follow-up on the previous one, the reason it's not so easy as it sounds is because, as I said before, a lot of these objects and draw calls are going to happen simultaneously on the GPU. So you can't really write to the depth buffer while all the others are reading from it, because that would cause. But maybe it can be updated in a certain way to still make it possible. I'm not sure if using atomics or something like that. Yes. Let's see, what was the other one?
I can read it for you if you like to.
What about doing direct ray tracing like you currently do in voxel space and indirect lighting in screen space like you used to? Yeah, the screen space lighting I was experimenting with early. I don't think it's a good idea to use that when I have the option to do it in voxel space, because there are just advantages with the voxel space. It's so much faster and the results are so much better. The screen space ray tracing had a lot of problems, and it also required the scene to be rendered multiple times, and it wouldn't really work. So was there anything else before we move on?
No, you're free to proceed.
All right. So reflections. Now, since we have a method to just shoot rays, that's what we're also using for reflections. And this is just showing the pure reflections. The reason it's black here at the bottom is that I don't render reflections if there is no, if they're not going to contribute to the pixel value at all, I don't draw them. So that's why they appear black, to save some time. And the rays here are also in voxel space, but the color are fetched from screen space. So let's see if we can find an example of where that is visible. I don't know if we can. And it's actually a good demonstration on how unimportant the color of the reflection is. Since I don't have access to the color information, most of the reflections are just going to be black, which is then not really reflections technically. It's more like a specular occlusion. But when you, in this case, you would see the truck actually here, because it is visible in screen space, but it's still like the color contribution compared to the reflection of the sky, which is not visible here, but it is visible in the reflection, is very, very small. So no matter what the color of the reflection is, it's still just gonna look almost black in most cases, unless it's something like an emissive material or a light source. So if we show the final image here, you're going to see that the contribution here is very, very small, but I think it's also very important. Like you can see here, the dark areas around the underside of the truck here, they're not really a shadow, especially not this part here. They are the effect of specular occlusion. So I think specular occlusion is very, very important for a realistic look of the image, and it's also one of the things I I miss in a lot of renderers. Like people don't consider it as important as, say, direct shadows from light sources or other types of shadows. But I think specular occlusion is very, very important to get these contact darkenings. It is not technically, or maybe it is technically a shadow, but it's more related to the reflections than the light coming from specific light sources. And you can see another example here. And since we do this with ray tracing, we also do this with respect to the roughness of the material. So a lot of the reflections you're going to see in the game are fuzzy. So the further you go from the object, the more fuzzy it's going to be, like this. So that was the reflections. Maybe we should pause here and show how that is done. Or did we have any questions on that?
You're welcome to type your questions. Did you do any experiments with voxel cone tracing?
No, I did not. I don't think it's... maybe it would work. It probably would. But I just don't see them. I'm personally much more interested in ray tracing and using stochastic methods to do the soft shadow thing instead of doing the cone tracing. So let's see, let's switch over to this one. And so for the lighting, let's redraw what we had before. We have the scene, can you see that? Yes. Scene here. We had a couple of objects. Let's make it a little simplified this time. Actually, I should zoom out. So here's our scene, and just for the sake of simplicity, say we have 2 objects in it, or maybe just 1. So it looks like this. It's kind of strange voxels, these. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this is what the object looks like. We have some kind of bounding box here. This was the yellow boxes you saw in the scene. And then we have, the reason I was drawing this scene boundary is that in Teardown, the whole scene also is a 3D texture, which is really big. I think it's close to 2000 by 2000 on the largest levels, by maybe 500 in height. So it can be up to almost a gigabyte in size, because it's only 1 bit per voxel. So I can actually fit 8 voxels in a single byte, because I don't store anything in there. I just want to know, is there something here blocking light or not? So I can do that with a single bit to save a lot of memory. So this is also a voxel volume. It has the same resolution as the objects, but it's not necessarily oriented the same way. So this one is always oriented in world space because it's only 1. And then we have a lot of rotated objects in that space, but they have their own individual rotations. So what we have to do is to translate this rotation into this one. And the way that works, it's actually done on the CPU. It's a multi-threaded, very optimized piece of code that does that every frame. It analyzes what have changed in the scene, and then I just go and splat all the voxels from the individual objects into the world space voxel grid. So this object would be splatted into something like this, because it has to be aligned with the world axis. So let's see if we can show that. So we have two versions of it. One is the object which is drawn to the G buffer, and then we have the what I call the shadow volume representation, which is a realigned and converted version of that is always axis aligned. And that is what's used. So all the lighting is happening in this space and not this one. So once the G buffer is drawn, this representation is never used. Everything else is done on this axis aligned representation. Other than that, it's pretty much the exact same method as I'm using to draw the G buffer. So starting array here, say, I just keep going through the voxel grid. I haven't drawn out all the grid cells, but they're here. They're aligned with the same here. Just keep doing exactly the same thing, checking for edge intersections and moving this one, that one, this one, and that one. And then we found a hit, and then we know this ray actually hit something. And what's nice with that is that we can also do this, since it's a 3D texture, we can just draw these, store these mip maps. So we have a 2 levels of mip maps as an octree also for the shadows, which is used a lot. As I talked about before, these 32 meter rays for the ambient occlusion, that's quite a lot of voxel steps, stepping through 32 meters. That would be something like 300-400 steps probably. But since it's done on these MIP levels, and a lot of it is just going to be stepping through large amounts of air, and that's actually relatively fast still. But I think this is probably the most important part in Teardown ray tracing, that this ray tracing happens on this representation and not on that one. All the RTX, so what RTX is trying to do, except it's not for voxels, it has so a lot of triangles like this. And then all the different objects also get a bounding box. These bounding boxes are stored in a bounding volume hierarchy, and for each ray you first traverse the hierarchy and then the individual triangles to find a hit, which obviously for doing that for millions and millions and millions of arrays every frame is very, very time consuming. Whereas in Teardown, when you have this big axis aligned voxel structure, it's comparatively cheap to step through this data instead of doing all that other stuff. And another really good thing with this way of doing it is that for some rays, the accuracy of the ray tracing is not as important. So in many cases, the ambient occlusion is actually a good example where I can cheat a little bit in the ray tracing. So instead of doing this more time-consuming Amanatize and Woo super cover algorithm to not have any light leak through stuff, it's usually okay to just step a fixed size through the voxel grid. So instead of doing this, if you have another ray here, I can, this was the ray, I can just step like this, the fixed steps. So maybe instead of checking 20 different voxels, because if I do the supercarve algorithm, I would need to check maybe all these voxels to make sure not to miss something. Whereas doing it more sparsely, I could technically miss something. If there was something here, I would miss it. But since it's just an ambient occlusion ray and there's lots of rays and they're randomized, so if you run into a small problem like that, it's not going to be too visible and ruin the image. But for the G buffer, that wouldn't be an option because you don't want to have random holes in your objects. So that's how the ray tracing works. Any questions?
I think it's all obvious.
Yeah, good.
And super clear. Please, if you have any questions, go ahead.
Wouldn't you be able to keep a smaller world texture centered around the player? It's actually an interesting idea, but any pixel you see on the screen needs to have this, because if you just remove shadows, it's going to be very visible because it's going to receive direct sunlight and stuff like that, even though it's hidden in a crease somewhere. So it looks really, really bad when you don't have this covered. And maybe I didn't mention it, and maybe it was obvious, but this large texture is of course the reason levels are relatively small and we have a size limitation on the levels. If it weren't for this, levels could be much larger in Teardown. This is where all the memory is consumed for the game. Do you always end up at MIP 0, even for ambient occlusion, where the cone is wider? It's a good question, actually. It depends on which pass. For ambient occlusion, I think that is the case, but I would need to check. But for reflections, I definitely do that. Reflection rays typically deviate a lot if you have rough materials. So if you have a reflection like this, incoming light here, and then out goes an array like that. For rough materials, it's typically you throw random rays around the perfect reflection. And the further you go, what I think you meant in the comment in the chat here was to maybe you shouldn't check the fine detail in the voxel texture at all. Maybe you should just stop at MIP level 1 or 2. And that's exactly what I'm doing for reflections when they've traveled a certain distance. So I start at a fine detail voxel grid like that, and then when I've been traversing this for maybe 10 voxels or something like that, I go over to the first MIP level and continue there, And then when it's been doing some of that, I switch over to the even bigger ones. And then if I find something here, if this was a hit, in some cases I just return like this probably hit something, even though I should technically go down the MIP chain and check if it was actually a hit or if it was something else. But for these very rough reflections, it typically doesn't matter very much. And I can show that in the game actually, because that's a difference between low and high settings, which is fairly visible. Let's see if we can find a good spot. I think this should be a good spot for it. Maybe not. Let's try. This one should be. Yeah, on water you can, since water don't have very rough reflections, it gets much more visible when you're near water. So let's see here. If you look at this here, and we switch back to high, you can see it gets much thicker when we go to low. And that's because we're just looking at the first level of the MIP map. And if I move back even further, now it's a little hard to see because the surface is moving, but as I move even further away, it's gonna be even bigger. Like now you can see the reflection of the truck is actually much bigger than the truck itself. But when I move closer, it actually gets smaller. So let's see, did we have any other questions? Did you?
No, I think you're fine.
Yeah. So what should we move on to now? Should we talk about physics or do you want more rendering?
First one to say, yeah, rendering. One vote.
Physics,
Vote.
rendering. Okay. Math.
I think physics is.
Yeah,
looks like it's winning out.
See. I don't know. Physics is a little harder to talk about because it's not so visible, and I don't have the same amount of visualization for the physics. I actually have a contact point visualization, but I don't think it's compiled in, right? Maybe I even removed it. So I do have one visualization for the physics, which is the bodies. So this is the rigid bodies of the scene. Anything that is a yellow box now is a dynamic body that you can move around. And you can see when I break something, the orientation of this box, it's related to the inertia tensor. The inertia tensor is how resistant the object is to rotate in certain directions. And I visualize that with this box, and that is of course recomputed every time you smash something. And just in general, I think physics has been much easier with voxels than with polygons, because physics really can take advantage of things being volumetric in a way that's pretty hard with polygons when it comes to that. So taking this as an example, when destroying something, there's always material on the inside, and the the algorithm for computing the inertia tensor for a voxel object is almost trivial. You just sum up all the voxels, and you know if the voxels have different materials, all that gets summed in the same loop, and you get a very accurate behavior of and center of mass, and all that is just recomputed from the voxels and their materials. So all of that, there is no hand tweaking, so to speak, for any of those things, which is what you typically have a lot of in when you make polygon-based physics. Because since you only have the surface representation, you don't know how it behaves, if it's hollow or if it's solid and stuff like that, whereas in voxels that just works. Physics in Teardown is a fairly regular rigid body simulation. There is really not that much to say about the solver. It does have a few things that it does very differently from other stuff, and one, I'm not sure how technical I should get here if we have any physics coders watching, but one very common performance bottleneck in physics is when you have all these contact points. That's when you do collision detection, detect something is close enough to generate a contact point, all those contact points get sent to solver that makes sure they just don't just stop the motion, so they can't move towards each other. And if they already started moving inside each other, you push them out and stuff like that. So one common thing that's takes a lot of you put a lot of effort in that in physics engine is to manage these contact points and pairs, because you typically need to track these contact points over time to make the simulation stable. And that has to do with something called warm starting or friction correlation. And if you haven't done your own physics, then you probably wouldn't know what that is or why it's important. But in order to make something actually not, if you have a pile of rubble and you want that to actually fall asleep and not just lay on the ground jittering forever, that's actually quite important. And for Teardown and for the solver I'm using here, I actually don't have any such pair management. There's no state in collisions or what's between two objects. The only state that carries over to the next frame is in the bodies themselves, which I think is a novel way to do a physics solver, but I'm not sure. That maybe someone did that before. And that has some consequences that you can see in the game. Typically things are really stable if you stack them like this. It can handle huge number of objects because you don't have to do this correlation. It gets really fast. And also the voxel collision detection generates an absurd number of contact points. So it would be very, very tricky to track all those. And since everything supports full concave collision detection, typically collision detection only works for convex objects, whereas when you do it like this with voxel collision detection, they can have absolutely any shape they want. And that also would have consequences if I were to do traditional pair management, because that usually relies on a convex intersection area between the objects. So anyway, where this goes wrong in the game, I'm gonna see if I can visualize that. Some of you might already have seen that. If I try, let's see if we can. see if I can do this. When objects typically have a hard time coming to rest when they are moving slowly or when they are on another larger rigid body that is not completely still. That was probably something else. Maybe if I'm standing here, yeah, you can see it kind of crawls a little bit. And that is an effect from this lack of pair management. It's usually fine for stacking things on something that doesn't move, but that can be a problem on ships, for instance. You can see it. It's also a problem on these little beach huts or these timeshare cabins. Let's switch the... I think the sandbox version still has the outermost cabin intact.
Someone destroyed it.
Someone destroyed it. I wonder who that was.
Criminals.
For that destruction to work the way we wanted, we actually made the entire outermost cabin a dynamic rigid body. So if I enable the bounce and hit this, or maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. Yes, it is. So if I hit it, you're gonna see it turns green and then it falls asleep again and goes to blue. So now if I go inside and just stand here, standing on something means that you wake up the body and try to stack things in this particular building. It's not going to be as stable as it typically is when stacking it on static ground, and now it seems to work for some reason. you can see a lot of artifacts in this cabin for that reason, but I can't really trigger it now for some reason. Anyway, I think the most unique, as I said, there's not so many things that are special about the physics, other than that there is a lot of it and you can actually destroy stuff. But the only part of the physics pipeline that is special is the collision detection. And we can maybe do a similar thing where I try to explain it by drawing it out. So I move over to this one and okay.
Dennis is not only doing the rendering and physics engine, he is also our concept artist.
Connectivity calculation. Looks like a flood fill type approach. That is entirely correct. It's just a flood fill. Okay, so for collision detection, we have voxel objects like this. Let's make another one here. I'm gonna try and make them approximately the same size, but that didn't really turn out well. Maybe I can rescale it a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so we have two. Why didn't that work?
Technology.
Yeah. No? Why?
You have to draw it.
I have to draw it. Ah, so rotation doesn't work when it's scaled. Could that be the case? No. Then I don't know. Okay, so let's. I wanted to show the rotation here, but oh, it's the other handle. Got it. Of course. So let's fill this in with something. So and the voxels here, even though they're visualized as cubes, in physics everything is spheres. I don't know if you noticed. How many noticed that that voxels are just spheres in the physics?
I did.
You did. The easiest way to see that is for very small objects, they tend to roll the way they shouldn't. Not even after 20 hours. That's that's good. Okay, so in the physics, the voxel objects looks like this. So let's make a voxel object here. And as you might understand, the real problem with having spheres when an object looks like this and ends up on the ground or like this and starts rolling. So I have something that detects one voxel objects that's very thin and just dampen the rotation. So you're not going to see too much of this rolling. I try to hide it as much as I can. But as long as it's more than one voxel thickness in any direction, it's not a problem anymore, because then it's gonna tumble over and stay the way it is. So let's make the other one red. And can have maybe a shape like this. And then we want to see if these collide. And this is where I want to rotate stuff, because then you can see say it's something like this. And normally in collision detection, you have convex objects and you do a search algorithm to find the two closest features. And when you have the features, you have an algorithm to clip them to generate contact points according to, and then you reduce the number of contacts. It's a pretty complex thing. Collision detection is really hard. And on top of that, you also have all the floating point precision errors, and it's a total mess to work with, and especially with destruction. If you're going to do procedural destruction with polygon physics, that's insanely hard and not very fun, because it just breaks down in so many corner cases that makes it super hard to work with. With voxels, on the other hand, almost none of that exists, because voxel objects can have, since there can be voxels anywhere, they can have any shape. There are no restrictions on convexity. There's no search. There's basically no search, because when I want to check something, if I want to check if this green voxel here collides with something, I can just transform this position into the see which voxel does that correspond to in the other object, in this one. And in this case, it would be this one, right? It's in that grid cell. And the only way that can collide with something is if there is voxel data here, or since we're not doing since it can technically mismatch by half a voxel, we also have to check these neighboring voxels. But as long as something is not moving too much, those are the only places I have to check for collisions. There's no searching. If you want to see if one voxel collides with something in the other object, it's pretty immediate. You just go in there and look if there's data, and if there isn't, there's no collision. But on top of this, doing this for all the voxels would be pretty time consuming, because as I said, there could be like 1 million voxels per object, and doing like 1 million by 1 million, that would be, I had to wait for hours for that to complete. So we have to prune this somehow, and you could do it in a more hierarchical fashion. I'm not doing that actually. You could use like this MIP mapping technique that we did for graphics, but instead it actually ends up not usually being that many voxels you have to check, because if objects could be like this, it would be a problem. But since they are physical objects and the bounds are pretty tight, it more often looks like this, maybe. It's supposed to stop before they start intersecting, right? So that usually means we don't have a lot of overlap. So the first thing we do is to check a voxel, or the first thing I do is actually to look for the bounding box intersection. So I transform, I try to find the bounding box of the intersection. So when checking voxels in this object here, I would probably end up with a bounding box check that is something like this. I don't have to check the other voxels because I know they will not collide with the other one. And when checking for voxels in this one, I'm going to do a similar thing. And in this case, since this one is oriented, I would probably end up with something like this, right? So I had to check, but it's still typically a very small number of voxels out of the whole object you have to check. And on top of that, there are actually more optimizations to be done. So before even coming here as a pre-processing step, when something changes shape, or when there is destruction, or when loading a level, or when something changes, I do a pre-processing step, which is pretty quick on each voxel object, where I classify voxels. And in this case, it would mean to see if something is either an edge, a corner, or an inside of an object. And then I remember that in a separate voxel representation. So there's actually one physical representation and one graphical that are both same size, and both are voxel data, both have 1 byte per voxel, but they contain different types of data. So for physics, I store, let's say this is a corner, we can call it C. This is a corner, corner, corner. There is one too. And this one is also considered a corner since it has this convex shape. This is considered an edge because the only way that could collide is with this one. It always has to, the normal would always point in that direction. So it can be treated a little differently. So is this one. This is also an edge. Edge. And this one is actually an inside. That don't have to be checked at all. And for this is a pretty small example, but in most large objects, most of the voxels are going to be like this. If you have like not thousands, but maybe 100 by 100 by 50 voxels, and it's more or less solid, it's going to be a lot of those inside voxels, and they're very cheap because they're not processed at all. So classifying the voxels like this, and then we do the same thing on this other one. So it's a corner, corner, corner. All these are corners. There's an edge, 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 and an inside. An edge can never collide with another edge, so they don't have to be checked. So when I check, when checking these edge voxels in the green one, I only have to check. Oh, maybe I'm saying this wrong. Let's see. For the corner ones, I have to check for all corner and edge in the other ones, and then I have to do the opposite thing. So I take the corners in the other and check for corner and edges in the first one. For edges, I actually don't. Maybe I'm remember this incorrectly, and it's also different in 3D than in 2D. So I actually have one more classification in 3D, which is face, and face cannot collide with face, but I have to check edge against the other edges. Sorry, this got a little confusing, but you get the idea. I'll probably write up the details on the blog, but the main idea is that I classify the voxels as a pre-processing step, and there are very much fewer checks than you would think. So typically, if you have face voxels, like maybe it's easier to see as an example here. If we go into this one, and I put this box on the ground here. This box was maybe a bad. Let's take this little bigger one. Also not a good example. I'm gonna find an object where this is easier to see. Actually, let's take the container. The container is a good example. It has, assuming the underside here is flat, it has maybe 20 by 60 voxels touching the ground. So that would be over 1,000 contact points if you generated one for every voxel. But since these voxels here are edge voxels, not anymore, there are only 4 corner voxels in this entire container, and that's the 4 corners that is close to the ground. Then we have 4 over here that's just discarded because of the bounding box test. For doing the collision detection against the ground here, only those 4 voxels are actually checked for collision against the ground. So there will only be contact points at those 4 corners. And since these are all face voxels, there are no edges, no corners, they won't be checked against the container at all. So this classification helps a lot with checking collisions, and that's kind of the key to making it run at this speed. And then I think it would probably be possible to add some hierarchical thing on top of that, but we'll see if maybe I'll experiment with that a little bit. Where it gets harder if you have something like this. Let me shoot off a little bit here. So I'm trying to keep the same volume. I'm gonna be a little careful and just shoot off. Yeah, something like that. And we look at the shapes here. We can see that this is still almost as many voxels as it was when I started, and so is this one. And now I put them in like an evil configuration, like this. Physics do not like this, because here we have a lot of overlap, a lot of empty space, and a lot of voxels that are both corner and edges, and they need to be checked against a lot of other voxels in the other object. So when things look like this, some of those beautiful optimizations don't really do that much. They really aren't that useful anymore. And that's also why you can see a big pile of rubble usually slows things down quite a bit, and that's precisely for that reason. Questions?
Yes, I wrote down a couple that might be related. I noticed that performance degrades when large objects are moving or small objects are moving rather quickly. Do you do anything like shapecast along the trajectory, or is this a side effect of something else?
I do a shapecast along trajectory, and that could be a whole other hour worth of talking and trying to sketch things on my iPad, which I'm obviously not very good at. But it's a continuous collision detection is super. If regular collision detection on polygons is hard, doing that continuously is a nightmare. But in voxel space, there are actually a lot of things you can do that makes that very easy by doing it at more discrete steps. Since everything is voxel, we have actually a safe distance. We can do this in smaller iterations. And everything is done with continuous collision detection in Teardown. You are sometimes gonna miss collisions anyway, because that's just the way it is. But in most cases, it's actually never going to, just because it has a high speed doesn't mean it will miss something. If it misses something, it's gonna be because of something else. Typically because the solver didn't manage to fully resolve a collision because there was a lot of weight differences or other things. But yes, there is CCD on everything.
A clarification here on that question. My question is about physics. Is that someone in Discord has been looking into performance leak where a lot of stuff being sledgehammered down into nothing causes really severe slowdown even if there is no rubber left. But burning it all down doesn't cause the same slowdown.
That's interesting. I'm very aware of this thing. I just haven't had the time to demolish an entire level into some tiny pieces to profile this. I'm pretty sure I can do something about it. I would assume it's just a lot of debris that somehow don't get removed or don't get recycled, or maybe the shapes get removed and the bodies still live on, or I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's fixable, at least. It used to be like this for fires, and I fixed it for fires, so it should be possible to do something similar.
There's another one that popped up a few times. I noticed while map making that there's a hard threshold of voxels you can have in a map before performance suddenly drops dramatically, almost halved. You'd assume more voxel equals more lag, but no, the performance drops only happen when I add more voxel to my map past this threshold. Any idea why this happens?
I'm not sure what this person means by more voxels. Is that more objects or larger objects?
Awaiting clarification.
Because if running on a laptop, for instance, it can sometimes, if you run out of VRAM, it can do that if it goes over to shared memory, maybe. I'm not sure. More objects
Yeah,
that have
that's
voxels.
the clarification.
So in that case, I don't know. I still think it can be a memory issue, but it's really hard to say. I haven't personally seen that one.
I'm curious, how large is large? Or what is this threshold?
So if we have any other questions? So I see people talking about the bending of pipes, and that is just joints and rigid bodies. There is definitely nothing, no soft body physics or something magic to it. It's just 7, 8 rigid bodies and joints. And there's the flood fill question again. It's just a regular flood fill. There's absolutely nothing special to it within an object. But then the hard part about detecting if something breaks and should fall off is not within the voxel object itself. It is how it's attached to other voxel objects. As I showed you before, the trunk here and the top part of the tree are 2 separate shapes. So if I break this in half, this part, this little stump, should stick to the other shape. And that's a whole different level of traversal. And that's also the reason you can see large buildings hanging in the air, because technically I would have to search through the entire map to make sure that something isn't connected. So I just have a hard limit of, I think, 15 meters maybe in each direction. Or is it 10 meters in each direction and 20 upwards and downwards? I can't really remember. And if it's still didn't contain the chunk that you shot off within that bounding box, then I'm just gonna assume that it is connected somewhere else on the map, which is not always the case if you break something really, really large.
We've also passed 90 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we should maybe round off here, unless we have a couple of last questions. Why don't trees burn? It's a pretty good question. There was a time when fire spread uncontrollably. Now it's a little bit more controlled for performance reasons, and if I set fire to grass, it was hard to put it out, and it started fires so often that it was kind of tedious to go and put out all those fires. And the leaves on the trees and the grass is the same material. But maybe I should give it another go. Maybe it's a good idea.
Some questions about fluid simulation.
Dennis did some fluid simulation stuff. So, the old Tuxedo Labs YouTube channel. Yes, that was 10 years ago, and it was actually not voxel based. It was a particle simulation. I don't think fluid simulation in this world is really realistic, considering we're already consuming a bit more computational power than we should. So adding fluid on top of that's probably not a good idea. But some of the the smoke, especially the extinguisher, actually uses fluid simulation or fluid dynamics to compute the motion. So, and that is actually based on the same techniques that were in those 10-year-old videos. So some of it is actually in there. All right, should we wrap this up? So thank you very much for watching. I didn't have a lot of time reading the chat, so if you felt like you had a question that didn't get answered, you can always reach out to me on Twitter or so, and I'll see if I can answer it. I will also put a lot of these. I'm now writing a series of blog posts on my blog.tuxedolabs.com. So a lot of the stuff I talked about tonight is gonna show up on the blog in one form or another. So keep an eye out for that. All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.